Okay, so the last video ended abruptly, but there's still some things I wanted to cover. So, at the end of the last video, we were mentioning how Benjamin Talmadge of Connecticut was introducing two amendments before Congress. The idea of slaves being freed in the Missouri Territory, of it was a slave state once they turned 25, and things like that. Um, and the purpose of this amendment was that its effect would gradually end slavery in Missouri, and over time, slavery would become extinct. Now, I mentioned that he purposely omitted the South in the amendments. Slavery already existed in the South. He didn't want to mess with them, but he didn't want to expand it west of this Mississippi. And that's what I spoke about, as how symbolically expanding it west of the Mississippi would just not be good for our nation. And that's an idea that Lincoln discussed also, and that the Southerners didn't like this, that he had death threats. And I said, if you want to talk more about this and his talks about dueling and things, I'd gladly discuss this. But what this brings up the point is, can we discuss slavery in the United States without violence? We didn't. It took a civil war, right? But this is that critical moment. Can we discuss it peacefully, or are there going to be riots and war? There's also the question of, does the Constitution allow to make restrictions on slavery? Right? We always think, does the Constitution really allow slavery? Well, I mean, it sort of did, because it didn't say it had to be banned to trade in for another 20 years. But did the Constitution allow slavery to be restricted? Talmadge, of course, thought that it did. So what we're starting to get into was the diffusion theory. So you need to think of some science terms here. Think of this as slavery in the South, and think of this as then maybe slavery in the territories out west. Okay, so if you allow slavery to spread, the idea was that you will make emancipation more likely. So, emancipation, think freedom, but also increase the standard of living of the slaves. The idea that these slaves live a better life than these slaves. Okay, there's examples. South Carolina, there was a black majority. Pennsylvania had a few slaves. So the idea is that if you have a few slaves, um, you're sort of they should be treated better, because if you have a whole lot of slaves, they will be more likely. And this sounds completely wrong, but the theory was that they would be more likely to create mischief. Look what they did in Haiti. They revolted. Now we think of that as a good thing, but if you're a slave owner, you might not have. Okay. Also about things like if slavery spreads, um, it actually will sooner expire because they'll be so diffused, so few and far between that I can't speak, few and far between, that the whites won't fear them rioting. Um, think about also how slaves would be west. They wouldn't be working on plantations, but they'd be growing wheat, they'd be mining. The idea is that that's a better case of living. Um, so this is his diffusion theory. Um, And of course, he thought slavery was a bad thing. He thought it caused derision throughout the world, it caused derision in the United States, and it's awful. And he also said, you know what, we look really bad to the world right now. The rest of the world is ending slavery, and we're talking about expanding it. Like, good job, US, right? So he also said it made us look bad as well. Think about topics in the news today and see if any of this, relates. Um, and there was more to it than this. The idea was that the expansion of slavery would expand power of the South, and they already thought that there was too much power in the South. We would like to think this was a concern over morality, that slavery is bad, but unfortunately, a lot of it was more a concern of power. Uh, People were upset with Southern control of the government. A lot of these people weren't even abolitionists. They weren't so much anti-slavery as they were anti-expanding South power. They really weren't motivated by this humanist concern. They were really just mad about all these Southern presidents and things. of course, we do get an abolitionist movement, and we do get people who are concerned about the morality of it. And there are some that were at the time. That just wasn't the major force quite yet. So there were moral grounds there, but it wasn't the prompt. They were really concerned about political activity and Southern dominance. So I thought I'd end this. There's a photo here of a statue. You may notice that's Jefferson. That's one of those Virginia presidents. And he was concerned about this as well. He was concerned about expanding slavery because remember, he did want the US to move west. That was his Jeffersonian vision. And even though he had slaves, we know he's a bit of a complicated paradox. And he even wanted to write how evil slavery was in our Declaration. So he wrote this letter, a famous letter to John Holmes, and there's this famous statement about how he had to grab the wolf by the ears. And um, I'm not going to get into it all right now, but he sort of bought into Talmage's diffusion theory. He thought that general emancipation might work. Um, he also thought that slaves might even leave, going back to Africa, even if they weren't born there, which we now know that theory doesn't make sense. But you know what? Lincoln supported this theory later as well. But he writes in this letter that it was a useless sacrifice of themselves by the generation of 1776 to acquire self government and happiness to their country, to be thrown away by the unwise and unworthy passions of their son. And that's my only consolation is to be. So, in other words, look what we did for a revolution, right? Those guys are old and dying out now at this point. Look what we did for freedom and liberty, and then look what's happening to our country. We thought that slavery was on its way out, and now you're creating this country of freedom and trying to expand slavery. And he was completely worried about it. Um, and this is why people voted at the time. They were worried about their station in life. Um, and this debate really changed American politics, which we will get to, in the later units. So if you have any questions about this, right, I wanted to go over the Missouri Compromise more because I did say it was really so important to understanding the next unit. So I'm glad you guys got the maps down, but please know the bigger issues here about Southern power, about sectionalism, and about the slavery debate that just gets even more heated to come. All right, so I'll see you next class once I end this.